Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Azure Administrator Study series. I hope you guys had a wonderful day and you're ready for another wonderful session by Sir David. So, Sir David, how was your day?
No, man, my day, I'm smiling a little bit. you,
Yeah,
you know the reason
I see
why?
the smiles.
Uh,
Yeah,
you know the reason why? Like, I tell you, Sir Coffee, like, I tell you something, like, what is it about? It's so funny. Have you ever, I'm sure that you do it all the time. Like, you just turn around to Rose and you just go, Rose, here's like, 5 bars of gold for you. And you just see the smile on the face, right? It's amazing like what's like money has power to do.
exactly.
So yeah, today has been a an
A very,
interesting nice day.
a very profitable day.
That's another good adjective. That's a good adjective to to describe it. A
Because I
profitable
mean,
day.
at the end of the day, the day is all about what? Every day obviously you're working and you are not just doing for fun.
Yeah.
Right, so it's a
Hmm.
value for the day. Every hour, every second, every minute, it counts. So
Mhm.
it's really good to see that. Okay, it looks like things are looking positive.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because here's the truth about it is that there's a good lesson there also. So the thing that Sakofi and myself knows that we're talking about. So here's the thing about it is that things didn't look that way at the beginning,
Yeah,
right? And then within a single day, everything changed, right?
right.
But also it's like similar to that. Like one of the things, Sakofi, when people, I'll ask for your advice in a minute, right? Um, like what you think about it. But whenever people ask me and people say, David, I want to get into IT security, I want to get into cloud security, I want to get into like this area of technology, what do you suggest? My suggestion has always been for people to go for a course where they have like an instructor, where there's like a structure. And my reason for that is one of the things I noticed at Coffee is you can give people all the material in the world,
Yes, right.
and probably about just 5% of all the people that you give the material to will actually study the material,
Yeah,
right? So, which is why, as human beings, we have to find a way to force ourselves to do certain things because certain things are not easy to do. So, we have to trick ourselves by forcing ourselves in a way, right? And
that's right.
that's one of the things that, this is about, like the study group, right? So, maybe by yourself, you're not going to say, yo, I'm going to spend 1 hour studying Azure every Monday or Tuesday. But you're like, okay, Sarkofi will be online. There's possibility that he's going to distribute gold bars. David is online. And then you go, okay, I'm going to be there, and it gives you a structure that you can follow, and it helps your learning process because the learning process is not easy. The beginning of the learning process is you have to be able to deal with frustration.
That's right.
That's
Absolutely.
from I'm not sure if it's for everybody, but for me, the beginning of anytime I'm learning a new technology is frustration
Yeah,
because it's like you're hitting your head against the wall. It's like nothing is making sense,
yeah,
right? And it's like this is too much,
yeah.
right? I'm not
That's
sure. What do you
I
think?
mean,
What's your thought?
yeah, you hit the nail on the head. At the end of the day, look, I mean, if you are new to something, it's your mind cannot process that concept, right? Until you expose it multiple times to it. That's why sometimes they say repetition, right? The more you repeat, it trains your brain, it trains the muscles, and then it create new what
Hmm.
connections in your brains to
Hmm.
understand that specific subject.
Hmm.
And the next thing you know, you understand. Imagine like riding a bicycle, right? At the
Hmm.
initial stage, right? You be falling, you be wondering, damn, there's no way I can ride the bicycle.
Hmm.
But the next thing you know, maybe a few trials, you
Hmm.
realize that you're riding a bicycle with no support.
Hmm.
And then your mind understand it. And then it's like it's second nature. You don't even think about it anymore.
Hmm.
So I think the same logic applies here. No matter what, whatever you do often, you
Hmm.
definitely become good at it. Right.
Hmm. That is absolutely true. So yeah, so that's one of the reasons. So take advantage of all these opportunities that we are creating in terms of community learning. Take advantage of that to learn a bit more because
Exactly.
I understand not easy.
Yeah,
It's not.
absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of information out there, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, like you said, you need to condition yourself, and they have to be some form of incentive. Or, like you said, sometimes you want to see, okay, if you pay for something, more likely you will you make sure that you're
You
ready
show off.
to understand it.
Yep, exactly. That is absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I think Sakofi, you'll be speaking at the next tech master for West Africa that she puts together.
That's
So
right.
I'm looking forward to learning about your story there. Okay, so
Definitely.
what are we going to do today? So also like to the audience, as you have questions as we go through these objectives, feel free to ask your questions. Sarkofi will sort of like be your voice. Sarkofi will be asking me questions as we go through the thing. But also put your questions in the chat window. Do not forget to like the video. That always helps. And if you're yet to subscribe to the channel, do not forget to do so. So, Sarkofi, what we're going to do today is we're going to carry on yesterday with what we were talking about on containerization for Azure or designing container solutions for Azure. And one of the things that we established yesterday is that designing is different from implementing, right? Although implementation is, you can consider it to be a little part of designing, because if you understand how something is implemented, you can probably spot some things that you need to consider, right? And actually, here's one of the interesting things. Everything helps each other. In some cases, you're not going to spot certain things until you implement it, right? It happens to all of us. You're like, oh, I completely understand this. And then you're speaking to a customer who comes up with a scenario that you've not seen before.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. You managed to confuse this one together and this one together, and you found something that you didn't see before, right? So it's always important to have some bit of implementation in line with your architecting. So what we're going to do is that we're going to carry on. We're going to look at Azure Kubernetes service. So yesterday we talked about Azure Kubernetes service, the architecture. We talked about the networking models that it supports, and we talked about other aspects of that. So today we're going to talk about the storage for Azure Kubernetes service, and we're then going to move over to talk about Azure Container Instances, and we're going to talk about Azure Service Fabric. So we'll see how we get on sort of like with the objectives today. So before we carry on too far, let's see. I have a question for our audience, and yes, some very interesting question for you. So as always, you have 1 minute that's going to be allocated to you. So train yourself before you go for your exam to be able to allocate something to like between 1 to 2 minutes to every question that you're going to be having to answer. So let me go ahead and bring up this one. So let's set that to 1 minute. Okay, so here's the question, audience. The organization has a requirement to deploy a multi-container application orchestrated by Kubernetes. You have chosen Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS, as your deployment destination. The containers require simultaneous access to the same storage volumes. Which storage option should you recommend? So here you have a scenario as an architect that you need to recommend a solution, and 1 minute starts right now. Right now. Yeah, let's go. So Sakofi, like, how was it? Because I remember you were telling me the stories at some time ago about when you started learning CCNA. How was it at the beginning? Was it making sense when you were learning it years ago, when you were doing your
No, I
CCNA?
mean, I think one of the things that helped was that my mindset was that, look, after uni, you've learned a lot of different networking stuff, but you don't seem to understand the practical application, right?
Mm,
So watching the videos and obviously learning it, the whole point was for me to understand and obviously have it see it in the real world, how people will see in the real world, essentially.
mm,
So that gradually made me understand it, because trying to make, like you described, you have a customer, you probably have learned something this way, and all of a
mm,
sudden uh you're in front of the customer and you realize that their idea of implementing that thing is totally different.
mm.
By exposing yourself constantly to different scenarios help. So that's what I had in my mind when I was learning these new concepts. I realized that All these things have to be understood in the context of what can be applicable in the world. And
Hmm.
that really helped me.
That's very, very important lesson, Sir Kofi. Very important. Okay, so I think that we have one answer in the chat window. So from VJ. So let's go ahead and let's see. Let's analyze the question and then that will lead us to our next topic. So your organization is deploying, first of all, you're deploying a multi-container um, application, right? So that's very important information, multi-container application. So you've chosen AKS as your deployment destination. The requirement here is your storage volume must allow simultaneous access to the same storage volume. So which storage option should you recommend? So essentially the question is, which of these Kubernetes, Azure Kubernetes service storage option supports simultaneous access to the same storage volume? So is the Azure Blob Storage, file storage, or manage this? So the answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, is Azure File Storage. Azure Blob Storage is not a native option. So it's not a native option to Kubernetes. You can probably implement it in your code, right? And use the Azure Blob SDK to integrate it in your code, but it's not native. That's going to give you extra development work to do. Azure File Storage is native, so you can implement it with the storage plugin in Kubernetes, and it's going to allow simultaneous access to the same storage volume. Azure Managed Disk, it's also native, but it's exclusive. You can do simultaneous access. So let's get into this topic and let's see what we're talking about. So we'll be very quick here. So what we're talking about is this, ladies and gentlemen. So when we talk about Kubernetes, Kubernetes usually treats individual pods as ephemeral, right? Which means the pod may exist today, it doesn't exist, in the next 5 minutes, right? It could be recycled, it could go away. And what that means is that any data that's stored on the container file system over here, that data is also sharing the life cycle of the pod, right? All you need to do is, if you're storing data on your container file system, if you delete or recreate that container, it's going to delete the data that you stored also, right? So in certain scenarios, some applications require persistent storage. So that's where volumes comes in when we talk about Kubernetes. So what volumes do is that volumes allows us to be able to mount an external data store and make it available to our pods at runtime, right? So volumes are just Kubernetes resources that's going to be backed by an external data store that's going to be a persistent store. So, and we can use volumes to do many things, but one of the things that we can use it to do is to do persistent storage. So the way that works is I have my volume defined that's linked to an external data store. I mount that volume using volume mount option within my pod spec, and that's going to make that available within my pod, and then I can write to that location, and essentially it's writing to the external data store, right? The advantage of that is that if the pod gets recycled, deleted, my data still remains because my data is stored externally. So when we talk about volumes with Kubernetes in general, there are multiple volume types that Kubernetes supports, right? It supports NFS server, right? Just a normal network file shares. So it supports something called host path. So we're not going to get into all of these because you're not going to be asked them in your exam. Maybe if we get into that Azure Kubernetes Service deep dive course that Sakofi and myself wanted to do, we'll be able to cover that. So we have host path that allows us to store data on the Kubernetes node, right? So with host path, what we're doing is we have data that's going to be stored directly on the node of that the pod is running on. We have emptied there, which allows us to store data in a dynamically created location on the node. So it's still going to be storing data on the node, but it's going to be dynamically created. You're not statically specifying it. We have cloud storage options. So, and for cloud storage options in Azure, we have two options. We have Azure Managed Disk and we have Azure File Share. So those are the two options that we saw in the earlier question, Azure Managed Disk or Azure File Shares. Now, with Azure Managed Disk essentially is for exclusive use access, right? So what that means is if you mount an Azure managed disk in a Kubernetes volume, only one pod can access it at a time, right? You can have multiple access, right? It's exclusive. So you see that Azure disk, they are mounted as read write once. So you can only do read and write only once, right? So essentially that means exclusive access available to only a single pod. So, and you can have Azure managed disk as premium storage, which means SSD, or you can have it as Azure standard storage, which means HDD. So just normal hard disk drive or SSD drive. So you can have premium or standard created. For the Azure file share option, oh, sorry. Let's go ahead and clean up the screen. So for the Azure Managed Disk option, so when you're working in production, you want to use Premium for production because of it has performance advantage to it. So it also has good SLAs. For the Azure File Share option, Azure File Share allows us to do simultaneous user access. So Sakofi, that was what we were talking about in the question.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
That was what the question was asking about. So it allows us to do simultaneous use case. So essentially, you can have multiple pods that are accessing the same volume at the same time. So essentially, it allows multiple pods to access simultaneously. The good thing about it is that because Azure File Share is backed by Azure Storage Account, you can have a premium storage account or a standard storage account, and premium storage account uses SSD. So which means that you can also use premium storage for SSD or standard storage for HDD. Any questions at all? Hopefully, does that make sense to the people watching? Everybody, everything all making sense? Oh,
Yeah,
Vijay, no. Sorry, carry on, Sakofi.
yeah, it definitely makes sense. So how do you define the volume in the what do you call it, YAML?
Yeah, very good question. So how do we do that if we're working with Azure Kubernetes Service? So let me go back to my slide. I think I actually have an example here for Sakofi. So here's an example. Actually, here's how the process works, right? And then I'll give you an example. So the process is number one, you create your external data store, right? I create my Azure managed disk or I create my Azure file share, right? That's the step for step. After I create that, I reference my external data store as a volume in my pod spec. So I can go, when I'm defining my pod, I can go specify a volume. And within the volume, I can reference either the managed disk or I can reference the file share. If I'm going to be referencing the file share, because remember that with Azure File Share, because it's using Azure Storage Account, you need to authenticate, right? For access. You need either the storage account key, a SaaS token, or use managed identity or an Azure AD identity, but you need to be authenticated and you need to have access using role-based access control. So you can reference the storage access key as a secret resource in Kubernetes, and then that's where you can mount that as a volume, and then that becomes available to your pod. So that is one way that we can use. So, and then once you've defined that, then you can use sort of like the volume mount definition to essentially make the volume available to your pod. So that's the process and that's how it works. So to Sarkovi's question, here's an example of that, right? So what you notice is this is using the Azure Managed Disk.
Okay.
So, and you notice just below here, we have our volume defined. So that's the first thing. So in this case, we're specifying the volume. We're giving it a name. We're just calling it Azure is the name that we are calling it. And we're defining the kind, it's Azure Disk. And then we have to specify the URI of the Azure Disk that we've created, right? And then when we've defined that, then we can now go mount that volume in our container spec. So in our container spec over here. So if you have a look and see the container spec, you see that we're now mounting the volume. It says, which volume do you want to mount? The volume called Azure, which is this volume that we created here. And which parts do you want to mount that volume within your container? I want to mount it at this particular path, and then it's going to mount it at that particular path.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so
I've got a question here.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, let me bring it up on the screen here. You said I cannot I cannot use blob in any way in AKS solution.
So you can use it within your code, but not natively. So the way that this works, because you know that Kubernetes is separate from like Azure capabilities, the way that this works is that there is a plugin built in for Kubernetes that makes it possible for us to use Azure Managed Disk and Azure File Share. So essentially, when you're defining your volume over here, that's going to be using a plugin that's built for Kubernetes. So it's a Kubernetes plugin that it's going to be using. There is a Kubernetes plugin for Azure File, for Azure Managed Disk, not for Azure Blob. However, you can, again, Azure Blob as an SDK, right? You can use the SDK to write your application that's running within your pod to talk directly to Azure Blob. So, that's an option. That's extra development work, but you have that option. Does that make sense? Hopefully
Yeah.
that answers the question that was asked. So let me show you let me see if I can show you an example of the of one of the options. Let's go ahead and let's bring up Notepad, and let's show you an example of what we're talking about. So here's a Notepad document. Let me go ahead and increase the font. So actually, I'm not sure because I think that I have an AKS cluster over here. So let's go to Kubernetes services. Sakofi, I'm still waiting to get like a solid. Um, I'm still waiting to get a solid laptop. It's
Oh yeah.
still, it's still, it's still not available. Like Microsoft Surface is still not available, so it's still a pain.
Still no date yet in terms of their time of availability.
None, zero. It's
Uh,
just completely quiet. It just says
when was it
out
released?
of
Was it
time.
released like this year?
Yeah, it was
And
released this year.
okay, and
Yeah, I think
already ran
so,
out.
or I thought so. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's so strange because, again, to your point, there's no information about this is when it's going to be available, blah blah blah, and all the other stuff. So, no information about that. And
It
so,
kind of strange. So, what about if obviously you don't want the second hand? Because I was thinking that because it's highly unavailable, people will be trying to sell them as high price.
yeah, that's what will probably be happening.
Yeah.
We have businessmen that will be doing that. So apologies, ladies and gentlemen, because I thought I had a Kubernetes cluster that was running, but I don't have anyone that's running. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this command to quickly spin the Kubernetes cluster up. Then I can show you working with Azure Managed Disk from within working with Azure Managed Disk as a Kubernetes an AKS volume. So apologies, I thought I had that, but apparently I deleted some services and I must have deleted it. Not everybody has Sarkoffi's deep pockets to be able to keep stuff running in Azure. You
Keep it
know,
running 24.
only few people can really keep stuff running indefinitely like that. Yeah, it's it's a completely different stuff. Oh, why is Azure a bit slow today? Come on. Maybe it's my internet connection. You know what? I should not be quick to blame Azure. It could be my internet connection. Yeah, this is too. Okay, it's doing something. Okay, not to waste time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to. So hopefully that gives you some needed information for Azure Kubernetes Service. So we talked about the nodes, we talked about this networking, we talked about the storage. There are other information that we can talk about, but I'm looking at the time. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move over to talk about Azure Container Instance, and then we're going to carry on from there. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's no rest today. We have 1 hour together, so we have to make the best use of it. So I have more questions for you. Actually, I have 2 questions for you this time around. So because we're going to be learning, but we're going to be testing our knowledge as we're learning. So there's no there's no slowdown. So let's go ahead and give you the next question, and then we'll go from there. So here's that's the next question. You have 1 minute again that'll be allocated for you to answer the next question. So let me read it first of all. You are designing a container solution in Azure that will include 2 containers. One container will host a web API that will be available to the public. The other container will perform health monitoring of the web API and will remain private. The 2 containers will be deployed together as a group. You need to recommend a compute service for the containers. The solution must minimize cost and maintenance overhead. What should you include in the recommendation? So, opportunity for you to test your knowledge. So, what we're going to do now is you have 1 minute started now. So, with the question again, let me know what you're going to include in your recommendation.
So one answer or multiple?
One, so just one answer. So it says it gives some requirements there, and it says your solution needs to meet this requirement, and some of the other stuff that it's put in there. Yeah, that's so. But if it's a coffee, look at how interesting this field that we are in. Look at how interesting. Remember the days that it was like the craze when it comes to certification was all CCNA certifications,
Yeah.
and then it became like all VMware certifications, and now it's like all cloud certifications, Kubernetes certifications, and all the other stuff. How long are we going to be able to keep up with this, Akofi? I mean, you don't need to. You have like gold investment, you have Bitcoin, you have all kinds of stuff. You're set for life. You know,
Once you're set for life.
like you are absolutely set for life. So, like, how long are we going to be able to keep up with this?
Yeah, I think that's how the industry is anyway. So people understand it anyway. So if there wasn't any demand for these certifications, obviously people will not be spending their time to do it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So 1 minute is off, is finished, but I can't see any answer in the chat window. Everyone is a bit concerned now. So no one is giving any answer.
I guess
So
we've really only talked about the Kubernetes. So
yeah.
yeah.
So this is like a different learning strategy that I got from someone. So in some cases, you can challenge the mind by asking the question before going through the topic. Right. In some cases, you get to the stuff at the end to see how much people have grasped what you've taught,
Yeah.
but also sometimes to get people to challenge their existing knowledge. Sometimes it's
I
good to
think
put the question
Vijay
ahead.
definitely have an answer. Maybe it's just trying to
Still thinking about it. Yeah. So, but we have to give the answer now because of time. So, the answer in this, actually, let's analyze the question. So, the question says, we're designing a container solution in Azure and it's going to include 2 containers. So, I'm going to design the solution that's going to be using 2 containers. One container is going to host web API and it's going to be available to the public. So, the public internet, it's going to be available, the web API. The other container will perform health monitoring of the web API. So this one is going to be performing health monitoring of that one. So essentially what is called a sidecar in the container world. So, and it's going to remain private. So this is not going to be exposed to the internet like this one is. So the 2 containers needs to be deployed together as a group. So I want to deploy both of these together as a group. You need to recommend a compute service for the containers. The solution must, number one, minimize the cost. Number two, minimize maintenance overhead. What should you include in the recommendation? So looking at this, I can eliminate Azure Container Registry, right? So I can't use it to run containers. I can use it to, store and distribute container images, but not to run containers. So I have 3 options: Azure Service Fabric, Kubernetes Service, container instances. Looking at the requirement, these 3 meet this requirement of I'm deploying containers together as a group, and I'm going to be exposing one of them to the internet. The other one will be private. I can use the 3 of them to implement that scenario. However, it says I want to reduce the maintenance overhead. We saw yesterday with Kubernetes architecture that we saw yesterday, if you remember, Sarkofi, we saw that they are the control plane components which are managed by Azure, but we saw that the worker nodes are managed by the customer.
Yeah.
So obviously that's not reducing our maintenance overhead. So we can sort of mark that down. The same thing with Azure Service Fabric, right? So it has a similar implementation. So we can a bit mark that down. With Azure Container Instances, the advantage to it is you don't have to provision or manage infrastructure resources. With Kubernetes service, you still have to manage infrastructure resources, right? It's still customer managed. With Azure Container Instances, that's not managed by the customer. So in this particular case, the answer will be Azure Container Instances. So let's see, review the answer, and that is Azure Container Instances. So one more question for you before we get into Azure Container Instance discussion. So you got to give me an answer for this. So let's read this together. Developers recently containerized a .NET Core application. The application needs to be hosted in Azure with the following requirement. It has to be deployed in a private network for communication with private services. It must be able to access an Azure file share for data storage. You want to minimize ongoing maintenance efforts. What service should you recommend to use to host the application? So I'll give you like about 1 minute, 30 seconds in this case to read through this one. So 1 minute, 30 seconds. So read through the question, analyze it, let me know what your answer is. Yes, Sakofi, the point is like very interesting, right? So are we going to still be, I'm sure, not for Sakofi. By then, Sakofi is like forgotten anything about IT, Azure. You're sitting down in a yard somewhere. By the time Akwasi is probably like, you know, probably a CEO somewhere or something. It's like CEO of Kofi and Sons Mining Limited. Because it's just so interesting. It's a profession where you constantly have to be learning.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think with every sort of profession, there might be something that you have to keep yourself up to date with that specific, industry. So
Mm,
with IT, unfortunately, things change a lot.
mm,
So you have to go with the wave, because if
mm,
you're still probably still sticking with the on-prem stuff,
mm,
you know that where the demands are is where the money is at as well.
mm,
Yeah.
mm.
We got a lot of answers coming in.
Wow.
So Vijay, Opemi, and
Mm.
also Ashore as well.
So we have D, C, and A. So time's run out. So let's go ahead and analyze the question and let's see what the answer is. So all of this is about improving our knowledge. So that's what it's about. It's about improving our knowledge. So number one, it says developers, of course, they are always demanding. I hope there's not if there's any developer on the call, apologies. If you try to sue me, I have like the person that's bankrolling all this stuff. I have Sakofi. He's going to hire a lawyer and we're going to counter sue or something. No. So developers recently containerized a .NET Core application. The application needs to be hosted in Azure with the following requirements. So let's look at the requirement carefully. It's going to be deployed in a private network for communication with private services. So essentially, this containerized .NET Core application needs to be able to communicate to private services in an Azure virtual network. So I'll just say to virtual network resources. So that container needs to be able to do that. It must be able to access an Azure file share for data storage. So you want to be able to have an Azure file share mounted or made available to this, and it's going to be mounted to that. And minimize ongoing maintenance efforts. So, what service should you recommend to host this application? So, as we saw earlier, so it's a similar situation because with many of these situations, you can implement with Service Fabric, a Kubernetes service, container instance. You can implement this, right? So a container, containerized application accessing Azure File Share that can access resources in a private network in Azure. You can implement with this tree. But the main thing here is that it says you want to minimize ongoing maintenance efforts. Again, as we saw earlier, when we talk about maintenance efforts, container instances as the least maintenance effort versus the others. So we can mark down Kubernetes service, we can mark down service fabric. But container instances, now we have two options. We have container instance Linux implementation, and we have container instance Windows implementation. So the question is, which of this container instance implementation allows me to implement this? And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, is the Linux implementation. Windows implementation of Azure Container Instance does not have this capability right here. Capability to be deployed into a private network is not supported by Windows implementation of Azure Container Instance. So let me just quickly bring that up on the document, and then we'll go into Azure Container Instance conversation in a minute. So let's go to get that option. Okay, so let me go ahead and bring this up. So what you see in this document that I'm about to bring up here. So let's go this document right here. So let's go ahead and restart this. I'm not sure why is he misbehaving today. Okay, anyways, so if you have a look at this document where Microsoft essentially compared Linux and Windows container on Azure container instances, you can see that some features are restricted to Linux containers. And one of those features is virtual network deployment. So deploying into a virtual network is not supported for Windows containers in ACI, only for Linux containers. And the good thing about it is that the question, even though it mentions ASP, even though it mentions .NET, it's referring to .NET Core, and .NET Core is cross-platform. So it can run on Linux, it can run on Windows, it can run on Mac. So because it's cross-platform. So the answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, is Azure Container Instances Linux implementation. So let's break down Azure Container Instances very quickly to us. So Azure Container Instances, if you go to Microsoft website for the definition, so again, feel free to ask your question as I go through this. Microsoft defines Azure Container Instances as the fastest and simplest way to run single containers in Azure. It's important to highlight that. So yesterday, Sakofi, if you remember, we looked at the elements of orchestration, right?
Yes, right.
Azure Container Instances, even though it provides some of those elements, it doesn't provide full container orchestration like Kubernetes or Service Fabric or OpenShift will do. So it doesn't provide that. So whenever you're doing your exam and you see questions around orchestration, you can begin to mark down Azure Container Instance, right? Because it doesn't provide full container orchestration capabilities. So, however, it's the fastest and simplest way to run containers in Azure. One of the reasons for that is because you don't need to provision or maintain virtual machines like you have to do for many of the other container runtime options in Azure. You don't have to do anything with virtual machines, so it's very fast. It also has fast startup time because, again, you don't have to provision a virtual machine from scratch and do all of this stuff. Typically, it has a faster startup time when you compare it with a virtual machine in Azure. So let's look at some information about this service. So number one, the underlying host of Azure Container Instance is managed by Microsoft. The underlying host can be Windows or Linux, like we saw in our question earlier. So it can be Windows or Linux. So depending on the type of container that you're running, if you're scheduling a Windows container to run, it's going to use a Windows host. If you're scheduling a Linux container to run, it's going to use a Linux host. So you can schedule your containers to run on the host that's managed by Microsoft. You or your application does not have direct access to the underlying container runtime, right? For Azure Container Instance. The significance of this is if the container that you're looking to run, it's a container that requires privileged permissions, right? A container that requires privileged permissions on the host right? Or anything that needs to be able to access the underlying host and all the other stuff, well, you cannot run that with this because privileged access is not supported. There's no direct access with that. So be aware of that. So let's move on. So when it comes to networking options for this particular container runtime implementation in Azure, it supports both private and public networking, right? So you can deploy. Oh, sorry, Sakofi, carry on.
Oh, no. I didn't say anything. Go for it.
Okay, yeah, sorry, yeah. So at any time, feel free to jump in, ask a question. You're the voice of our audience. So,
Okay.
so at any time, feel free to stop me and ask me to explain something that doesn't make sense or to clarify something, and feel free to do so.
Yeah.
So we can deploy Azure Container Instance. We can deploy it into a private network in Azure. So remember the question that we saw, or we can expose it publicly with a public IP. So what that's going to look like is I have my container instance deployed it on that host managed by Microsoft. I expose a particular port. So if I deploy it into just Microsoft managed public network, it's going to have a public IP address. If I deploy it into a private network, it's going to have a private IP address. And then I can specify the ports that I want to expose. How many ports can I expose if I'm using Azure Container Instance? You can expose up to 5 ports per container. So whenever I'm exposing the port, I can expose up to 5 ports per container. So be aware of that. So Windows containers is not supported for private network. So that was our question earlier, Sakofi. Remember? So if you want to do private network, you can use Windows containers. So actually, one of the things that you see is that with Azure Container Instance, Windows containers is not that popular because it has a lot of limitation, right? It doesn't support private networking. Like many other things that we saw, it doesn't support GPUs. I don't believe that it supports volume mounting. So if you want to mount a volume for persistent storage, it doesn't support that. So essentially, it's very limited, right? So there are certain scenarios where maybe what we want to do is we want to run multiple containers to run together on the same host, right, Sakofi? Again, similar to what our question asked. In that case, there is a construct called container groups that we can use. Container groups allows us to schedule multiple containers to share the same lifecycle and run on the same underlying host in Azure Container Instance. So in this case, I have a container group where I have 2 containers running in that container group. I have the web front end, which is exposing a public IP address or a private IP address, whichever option, right, that's been exposed. And I have another container image that's not exposing anything publicly. So it's private. Again, similar to the question that we saw earlier. You want to deploy them as a group. One of them is public, the other one is private. Essentially, they're running together on the same host. You can use container groups for that. So containers that you schedule to run together in a container group, they share the same underlying resources. They share the same local network. So essentially, the importance of this is this, Sakofi. If I were to be able to access this particular container, right?
Yeah.
And from within this container, I'm saying, show me all the ports that I'm listening on and everything like that. It's going to show me this port also.
Yeah.
So essentially, they have like the same life cycle. They're sharing the same local network, right? So essentially, it's like both of them are sharing the same local network. So if you do show me what's listening on 127.0.0.1 or on localhost, it's going to show this one also, right? So they're sharing the same underlying resources. And actually, this is a good point to mention this. So let me quickly bring up the screen. So tomorrow I'll be speaking at Cloud Native London. So Cloud Native London, I will be speaking. And if you can't join that, so I just wanted to quickly throw this one in there. So Cloud Native London, September 1. I will be speaking, and one of the topics that I'll be looking at is services like Azure Container Instances and how attackers exploit them, right? So tomorrow, I'll put this in the chat window. So Cloud Native London, there's a lot of people that are registered to attend. It's a very popular event.
Yeah. What time is it?
So it will be, I think, similar to the time that we have, but it's going to be from 6:30 p.m. GMT plus 1. So 6:30 p.m. UK time, West African time. So 6:30 p.m. to 9. So I'll be the first speaker. I'll be speaking on how attackers exploit containerized Azure workload. So if you want to see, how attackers do their dirty work, join this event tomorrow. Let me see that. So join that event tomorrow, and I'll be live and I'll be demonstrating. I have some nice demonstration on
Nice.
that topic. Okay, so
Nice
let's
one.
go. Let's go back to this one. So I'll be showing, like, we'll be getting into the internals of this. So anyway, so we have container groups that we can use in that sense. So again, it's like Windows containers is just bad on Azure Container Instance, right, Sakofi? It's
Doesn't
like it's not,
support.
it's not supported for almost everything. It's not supported for private networking. It's not supported for container groups, so you cannot run multiple containers together. So it has that limitation. So if you're doing your exam and you're seeing questions about that's essentially talking about Windows and Linux containers running on Azure Container Instance, and you're seeing that it's talking about a lot of capabilities, it's probably not going to be Windows, right? So Windows lacks a lot of capabilities with Azure Container Instance at the moment. Hopefully, Microsoft are going to improve that. So, anyways, what about persistent storage? How does that work? So, persistent storage is currently supported only for Azure File Share. So it works similar to the way the one that I showed you earlier for Kubernetes works. So which is you mount a volume. So essentially what you do is you have an Azure file share that you've created, and then you can specify that as a volume when you're defining your container group.
All right.
And then what you do is that you mount that and specify the location that you want to mount it as, and that's going to be available to your container. So essentially, then you can store data persistently on Azure File Share using that option.
So no manage takes or the NFS.
No, 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 none of the options. So just Azure File Share. However, guess what, Sakofi? Not supported for Windows containers. Poor Windows containers. Life is not easy. so, so one of the other things that Azure Container Instance supports is that it supports dynamic runtime configuration, so we can pass environment variables to our containers at runtime. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to show you like a demo of Azure Container Instance using the file share mount. So let's quickly go have a look at this. So, and what I've also started doing, Sir Kofi. So our audience, they may or they may not like this. So what I've started doing is the demos that I'll be showing, I'm already hosting them on in my GitHub repo, so that in case anyone wants to be able to follow the demos that I'm showing to you in your own time, you can just go to my GitHub repo. I'll put the link in the chat window right now. So if you go to that link, the demo that I'll be showing you right now on Azure Container Instance, that's going to be here. So the first thing I need to do is I need to create my storage account, Sarkofi. So I need to go create my storage account. So let's copy that. And what I'm going to do is if I have Cloud Shell, I have Cloud Shell now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I need to create a resource group first of all. So let's do AZ group create, and let's specify, so it's create dash name RG dash location or dash L UK South. Okay, so it's created my resource group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the location variable, and I'm going to set that to UK South. So I have my resources in UK South. So I've got to be quick with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this again. So let's go ahead and paste. And what that's going to do is that it's going to create a storage account for me, and it's going to create a file share in that storage account. So that's the first thing that I have. So let me open that in Microsoft Edge. I know that Akofi, you've been liking Edge recently, right? I think that you said you've been using it more recently.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, at the moment, from my experience, it looks kind of like Chrome.
Chrome, right? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
because it's using Chromium in the essentially it's Chromium based also.
yeah. But it's kind of nice though.
Yeah. Okay, so it finished creating my storage account. Let's go verify that I have my storage account created now. So let's go to storage and let's go to storage accounts. Here we are. So
Oh,
under my storage account, I should have my storage accounts there. Let me maximize that a little bit for people to see. And so that's my storage account that I just created now. And if I go to the file shares, I have a file share that I created using that just now. So that's the file share. So at the moment it's empty, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount it inside a container, running in container instance. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back and I'm going to run the next part of the script. Let's go ahead and run that. So essentially I'm going to obtain the storage account key for what I just created. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to create the container with file share mounted volume. So the command that I'm going to be using for this, let me go ahead and actually, you know what, let me copy this. Let me bring this up on the window here. So essentially I'm going to be using AZ container create, and I'm going to be specifying the file share volume account name, specifying my storage account name. For the file volume account key, specify my storage account key. For the file volume share name, I'm going to specify the file share name that I created, and then I'm going to specify the path to mount that within my container. My container application is going to mount it on that path. So this is me using Azure CLI to do that. If I want to do YAML, I have a YAML option in the document that I shared with you. So I have a YAML option there. So if you have a look at the YAML option, it's a similar thing. So similar to the way Kubernetes works. So first of all, you define your volume, where you define the storage account name, the storage account key, and the share name. And then when you're defining your container that's running, you specify a volume mount, where you specify the name of the volume that you defined earlier and the path that you want to mount that volume as. So this is the same way if you're doing that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this option, and I'm going to use this option to create that. So let's go ahead and run that. So that's going to create a container instance that's going to have that mounted, and then I'm going to test it out. So it's going to be really, really quick. It's not going to take a long time to create. So it's only going to take a few moments because it's not provisioning anything under the hood. So by the way, here's a trivia question. What do you think Azure Container Instance uses under the hood? Do you think it's using? What do you think it's using? Do you think it's using?
sure.
Uh, which one do you
It
want to
might-
say, Scott?
I was just going to speculate. It might be using Azure Fabric, right?
Azure Service Fabric.
Service Fabric.
So you're right. So it uses Azure Service Fabric. It uses Azure Kubernetes Service.
All
It
right.
depends. So
Yeah.
it's one of the things that I'll probably talk a little bit about tomorrow, not in details, but I'll probably mention um, in terms of if you're using Azure Container Instance in the backend, depends which one you get. So, anyways, if I go back to this one and if I go to test it, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to exec into my container instance that I just created. And I can see that I'm already in that container instance there. So I'm connected to it. So the location that I mounted that is ACI/data. So if I go to list, ACI data, at the moment, there's nothing in that. If I go to my file share, if I refresh, there's nothing in that. So if I go ahead and I go to create a file here, so touch ACI data 01.txt, and it's created that. If I go back to my file share, you can see that that exists there. So it's mounted that. So with container instance, I can go ahead and I can stop it, I can restart it, I can do any of this other stuff, and my data is still going to persist. All you just need to do is, so essentially I've decoupled the data from the container instance. So let me round this up very, 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 very quickly. Very, very quickly. So some consideration or some information to consider when we talk about Azure container instances. Here are some information to consider, ladies and gentlemen, and then we'll bring everything to a close, except you have any questions for us. So, number one, let's talk about use cases. So, the use cases for isolated containerized workloads that does not require orchestration. So, that's important. When you're doing your exam and you have a choice of container services, if it says orchestration, you can pretty much eliminate Azure container instances. If it talks about simplicity, reduced maintenance overhead and all of those type of stuff, container groups, you can look at Azure container instances. So, just simple application. So you want to do task automation, build job. Another popular use case is Azure Cognitive Service, which is AI as a service in Azure. You can run it as local containers. So people can host that container in Azure container instances, send requests to it, to do their processing. So again, it's low cost and it's very fast. You don't have management overhead. There are some factors to consider when we talk about performance or startup performance, when we talk about container instances, right? So, because I just deployed the container just now and it just deployed in a few seconds. It doesn't mean every deployment you do is going to be a few seconds. There are certain factors involved. So, number one, the image size, right? So, the amount of time that is going to take Azure Container Instance to download a 30 megabyte image is not the same amount of time that is going to take it to download a 10 gigabyte image. So if you're trying to deploy a 10 gigabyte image, it's going to take longer for it to start up. So that's a factor that's going to affect your startup performance. What's the maximum image size that Azure Container Instance supports? That's 15 gigabytes. Another performance factor that you can look into is image location. If your container instance is in UK South and the container registry that you're pulling from is in, let's say, East US, there could be a little bit of latency. Maybe not that much, but there could be some latency. So you want to keep the runtime and the data store for your images as close as possible together. Azure container images, Azure container instances caches some images, right? So it keeps some images in a cache to help the startup performance. What's the significance of this, David? Let me quickly show that to you. So if you go back to the repo that I shared with you earlier, if I go under container instance and I have cached images here. So let me go ahead and get this information and run this very quickly. So exit, clear the screen, and let's go ahead and run this. So what is this showing to me, Mr. Kofi? What is it showing to me are images that Azure Container Instances have cached in UK South location, right? So that is what this is showing to me. So you can see that there's a lot of images, right? So I'm saying, get me all the images that are cached in UK South. The significance of this is if my application is using any of these base images, right, it's going to be faster when it starts up because it's already cached. It doesn't need to go download them. So if you find out that your application can leverage one of these cached images instead of another one, please use the cached images. It's going to help you to get faster startup time, right? Does that make sense, Kofi?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So let's quickly bring this to a close. So also be aware, Windows containers have a very poor wrap with Azure Container Instance. If you're running Windows containers in Azure Container Instance, there is a 30-second network readiness latency. What that means is that when a Windows container starts to run on Azure Container Instance, in the first 30 seconds, there won't be network activity that's going to work. Then after 30 seconds, network activity will start to work.
So why do people use that?
So
too many limitations.
Exactly. But if you're still using Windows containers, then that's the option that you have to do. So Microsoft's recommendation is if your application requires network access, you probably want to add some retry logic or some delay logic to say don't do any network activity. Wait for 30 seconds before you do that. So you can find that in this document where Microsoft says, Windows containers, you can get up to 30 seconds, and it
or
can be
even
even
longer.
longer in some cases. So when it gets to those cases, what we advise is add some delay, add some retry logic to avoid that. But for Linux containers, it starts network connectivity straight like that. So be aware of that. There are many other things that we can talk about, Sir Kofi, but I think that we've run out of time and I won't like to extend this. So I wanted to talk about things like operationalizing it, but I won't be able to get into that. So hopefully, like what we've talked about between yesterday and today has given you some good foundation that you can build on when we talk about designing containerized services or containerized solutions in Azure. Hopefully, you have a better understanding than when we started. So we're going to continue next week. Hopefully, we'll be able to get some guest speakers in, presenters in, that will be able to talk about that. Please, if you're yet to like this video, please do like the video. And
Like
if you're
the
yet to
video.
subscribe, please do subscribe. So I'll hand over to Sakofi. So that'll be it for now.
And can you bring up tomorrow? Sorry, next week topic. I mean, do you used to have the
I can pull it up very
topic?
quickly. Let me pull it up very, very quickly. So pulling it up now. In Africa, they'll say, or in many countries in Africa, they'll say, when a king asks you, why are you to say no? Sarkozy says, can you pull up something? And I'm like, no, Sarkozy, you want
So
to be
you
in
don't have
trouble.
it.
So, yes, sir, Sarkozy, here is the information that you asked for. Here. Yes.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the timetable for our event. So, make sure you bookmark this if possible. Take a screenshot or whatever you have to do. So, for next week, which will be, or is it?
6th and 9th, this one.
Yeah, 6th and 9th. All right. So we were looking into the platform as a service, serverless compute solutions. And so that's the 6th and 9th. Okay, and the 9th. And then we were looking into the design of Azure database solution. So if these are topics that you're interested in, do well to be part of it. And or even if you're not, these are for the certification. So it's it's something that you should know if you want to take these exams. So make sure you join us next week, definitely. So with this one, more likely will be delivered by a guest host, right? Next week.
I hope so. I really hope that there'll be people that will be able to help to deliver it. So
So it will be it's exciting times at the moment. So make sure